Israel, a coincidence or God's plan? As we think about the end times, the question we need to consider seriously is God actually engaged in the world we live in? If he's not engaged, then everything that seems miraculous is just coincidence. But if he is engaged, especially as it relates to his return, then what would it look like? What did it look like at his first coming? On May 14th, 1948, Israel became a nation. Again. Is that just a natural event? A coincidence? How many other nations can you name that have been a nation, were completely dispersed from their land, and then came back as a nation? If you can name any, I don't know of any other than Israel. How long were they dispersed? For Israel, it was over 1,800 years. Do you really think that is just a coincidence? Some people believe that the church has replaced Israel. There's no doubt that their system of temple worship was destroyed in 70 AD, and their nation was decimated in 136 AD. And the church is clearly God's means of bringing salvation to the world. But the big question I wonder is, why do the Jews exist at all? Why are they not completely absorbed by the people groups they fled to? Why were they not killed by those that hated him, like Hitler and the Arab countries of today? Did God try to replace Israel with the church, but was simply unable to finish the job? Was it the indomitable spirit of the Jewish people that gave them the power to rise again in opposition to God's plan of replacing them with the church? While Christ is certainly the underlying focus of the Old Testament, the explicit text is clearly about the Jewish people from Genesis to Malachi. That's undeniable. My question is that irrelevant? In other words, why is it that the Jewish people and no one else that has ever been dispersed and come back as a nation? Is it just a coincidence that the very people who are the focus of the Old Testament are the only ones who have been destroyed as if they were dead and then come back again to life? Or is it yet another picture of God bringing life from the dead? If it's not simply an irrelevant coincidence of human effort, then the question is, why now? As you consider whether or not 1948 is just a coincidence, you really need to answer the question in light of Romans 11. We don't have time to look at all of that right now, but let's just look at verse 25. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. This verse is very clear. Even if we argue that the church has replaced Israel as God's primary agents of grace in the world, the hardening is only partial. There will come a time when the fullness of the Gentiles will come in, and the partial hardening will end. When the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, what will it look like? If you had lived in the time of Jesus' birth, what would you have thought about the things happening around you? Was God engaged at that time, or were things that happened just coincidence? It's true that God sent angels to a few people, but to most people, would the times have seemed out of the ordinary? Would they have known that they were living in the center of human history? And what of all the years just before his birth, and between his birth and his ministry? Does God prepare things before their fulfillment in human history? When the fullness of the Gentiles does come in, how will the focus shift? Consider Romans 11:12. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Is that inclusion simply hypothetical? Is this simply the longing of Paul and not the Word of God? Is God hoping that the Jews will be included, but simply powerless to do anything about it? Because, after all, it's up to their choice. I'll end this video with this thought. It seems that Romans 11 is clear that there will be a time that the fullness of the Gentiles will come in. At that time, the partial hardening of the Jews will end, and there will be a full inclusion. Which then is more likely? That the human will of a nation rebellious against God has reestablished that nation after 1,800 years, contrary to God's will, or that God is working in a way that, similar to his first coming, will find its fulfillment within a lifespan of what started. As I said in my video on upper bounds, We are reaching a point in history when we can answer that question pretty decisively. Either God is doing something or He's not. That's something to think about and pay attention to.